What happens when a Paralympic champion, a crowded airport, and a moment of disrespect collide? Helen Carter's story isn't just about standing her ground, it's about changing the game for everyone who's ever been overlooked. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The bustling terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was alive with a cacophony of sound. The wheels of suitcases hummed over polished tiles, voices overlapped in a symphony of accents, and the occasional announcement crackled over the PA system. It was a typical Monday morning, and the air carried the urgency of passengers hurrying to make their flights, many dressed in business attire with expressions of determination etched on their faces. The main concourse stretched endlessly, lined with storefronts offering last-minute travel essentials. A Starbucks stood at one corner, its line curling out onto the pathway. Baristas moved in well-practiced rhythms, handing over steaming cups as customers impatiently tapped their feet or scrolled through their phones. Overhead, digital screens flickered with departure times, alongside a banner proudly announcing, "Paralympic Games, Beyond Limits, Countdown Begins." Among the crowd, Helen Carter navigated the flow of travelers with a deliberate calm. She leaned slightly on her black cane, her right leg stepping carefully in sync with her prosthetic one. Helen was dressed simply, black slacks and a pale blue blouse, but there was a quiet dignity about her that made her presence hard to ignore. Her graying curls framed a face marked by both age and resilience. Though she moved slowly, she exuded an air of determination that had carried her through countless challenges. Reaching a row of seats near Gate B24, Helen lowered herself into one with a sigh of relief. Her fingers briefly adjusted the strap of the tote bag slung over her shoulder before retrieving her phone. The notification light blinked, a reminder of a scheduled call she had been delaying. She glanced around, noting the murmurs of conversations and the occasional glance in her direction. But most people were too engrossed in their own lives to notice her. Taking a deep breath, she tapped the screen to dial. A soft voice answered almost immediately. "Helen, we're so excited to have you at the conference. How are you holding up?" The warmth in the voice was genuine, but it carried a trace of concern. "I'm fine, Sarah," Helen replied, though her voice betrayed a hint of weariness. "I'm just at the airport waiting for my flight. Everything's on schedule." "We can't wait to hear you speak," Sarah continued. "Your story is going to inspire so many people. It's a privilege to have a Paralympic gold medalist like you as our keynote speaker." Helen's lips curved into a modest smile. "It's not about me, Sarah. It's about the message. I just hope it resonates." After a few more exchanges, Helen ended the call. Placing her phone back into her bag, she leaned against the seat, her thoughts swirling. She had been in the spotlight before. Her triumph at the Paralympics had been celebrated nationwide, but this time felt different. The pressure wasn't just to share her achievements, but to confront the deeper challenges faced by the disabled community. She couldn't shake the fear that her audience would see her only as a symbol, rather than as a woman with complexities and struggles of her own. Across the terminal, a large screen flickered to life, displaying a highlight reel of past Paralympic Games. Among the clips was a younger Helen, crossing the finish line with an unmistakable expression of victory and relief. Her prosthetic leg gleamed in the sunlight, a testament to her strength. A few people nearby paused to watch, their whispers carrying snippets of recognition. "Isn't that Helen Carter?" a woman asked her companion, pointing at the screen. "I think it is," came the response, tinged with awe. "She was incredible back then." The admiration in their voices stirred conflicting emotions in Helen. Pride mingled with unease. While the recognition was flattering, it also reinforced her fear. Would they ever see her as anything more than that moment frozen in time? The medal, the cheers, the accolades, they were important, yes, but they were not all of her. As she adjusted her cane and prepared to board her flight, Helen's mind wrestled with the path ahead. The conference represented an opportunity to advocate for change, to push for equality and understanding. But it also meant opening herself up to scrutiny and potential disappointment. She had faced countless hurdles before, yet the weight of this one felt unusually heavy. The bustling hallway at Hartsfield-Jackson was packed shoulder to shoulder with hurried travelers. Helen Carter gripped her cane tightly, carefully maneuvering through the moving crowd. The air buzzed with the hum of conversations, rolling suitcase wheels and the occasional impatient sighs of people trying to navigate the chaos. Helen's focus was on every step, her prosthetic leg moving in rhythm with her natural one. She kept her gaze steady, determined to make it to her gate without incident. But not everyone shared her patience. Suddenly, a sharp shove from behind sent her stumbling forward. Her cane slipped from her grasp and clattered loudly onto the polished floor. Helen fell to one knee, her tote bag spilling some of its contents, a folded pamphlet, a bottle of water, and a book, scattering across the tiles. Behind her, a man's voice rang out, sharp and irritated. "Come on, lady. You're blocking the way. Some of us have places to be." Helen turned her head to see a tall man in a crisp airline pilot's uniform. His hat was tucked under his arm, and his expression radiated annoyance. He made no move to help her, instead glancing at his watch as if even this brief interruption was an unbearable inconvenience. The pain in Helen's knee shot through her, but the sting of his words hurt even more. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm, "but you didn't need to shove me." He huffed, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't have time for this. Maybe don't stand in the middle of the walkway next time." The commotion had drawn the attention of nearby travelers. A young woman knelt down to help Helen gather her belongings, while a man in a suit handed her the cane. "Are you okay, ma'am?" the woman asked, concern evident in her tone. Helen nodded, though her cheeks burned with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "I'll be fine, thank you." Meanwhile, the pilot, Brad Mitchell, as his name tag revealed, stood off to the side, his arms crossed impatiently. "Let's not turn this into a whole thing," he said to no one in particular. "I'm running late." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. People pulled out their phones, some recording the scene. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the onlookers, their whispers carrying words like disrespectful and unbelievable. "Seriously?" A voice called out from the back of the group. "She's Helen Carter. She's a Paralympic champion." At this, a few heads turned toward Helen with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. Someone else chimed in. "She's a national hero. How can you talk to her like that?" Brad's expression barely flickered. He shrugged, his tone laced with indifference. "I don't care who she is. I've got a job to do." The tension in the air thickened. Helen could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. As much as she wanted to shrink away from the attention, something inside her refused to let this moment pass unchallenged. Before she could speak, a uniformed airport security officer stepped forward. He was a young man, perhaps in his early 30s, with an air of calm professionalism. His badge read, "Charlie." "Sir," he addressed Brad firmly, "I need you to step aside and explain what happened here." Brad's jaw tightened. "Explain what?" "She tripped. I didn't do anything wrong." Charlie didn't budge. "There are multiple witnesses, and I'd like to hear both sides. Please cooperate." The crowd murmured their approval as Charlie turned his attention to Helen. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" he asked, his tone softer now. "I'll manage it," Helen replied, gripping her cane as she pushed herself to her feet. "But this man shoved me without any regard, and then he spoke to me like I was insignificant." Charlie nodded, his expression unreadable, before looking back at Brad. "I'm going to need you to wait here while we sort this out." "This is ridiculous," Brad muttered. "I don't have time for this nonsense." But the crowd wasn't letting him off the hook so easily. People began voicing their support for Helen, a few even confronting Brad directly. "You should be ashamed of yourself," one woman exclaimed. Another added, "She deserves an apology." Brad's face reddened, but he remained defiant. This is getting blown way out of proportion. Helen, standing tall despite the ache in her knee, met Brad's gaze. Her voice, steady and resolute, cut through the noise. "What's blown out of proportion is your arrogance. You think your time is more valuable than someone else's dignity." The crowd erupted in agreement, and Brad, now visibly uncomfortable, took a step back. Charlie raised a hand, calling for calm. "All right, folks, let's keep things orderly. Ma'am, would you like to file a formal complaint?" Helen hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up against behavior that so many people face but rarely challenged. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "For now, I'd just like to get to my gate." As the tension began to subside, Charlie motioned for another officer to assist Helen. The murmurs of the crowd lingered, and several people continued filming as Brad stood off to the side, his defiance giving way to an uncomfortable silence. Helen adjusted her cane and began walking again, her steps slow but purposeful. The incident might have ended for now, but she could feel the stirrings of something much larger taking shape. Helen sat down on a bench near gate B24, placing her cane carefully against the seat beside her. She exhaled slowly, her hand brushing against her knee where the sharp ache lingered from her earlier fall. The crowded terminal seemed to move in slow motion around her as she took a moment to steady herself. Her eyes drifted over the passing faces, some stealing glances her way, with expressions ranging from concern to curiosity. She could feel the weight of those stares, each one a reminder of the scrutiny she had grown accustomed to over the years. While a few people approached, offering quiet words of encouragement or asking for her autograph, she politely declined, raising a hand with a faint smile. "Thank you, but I'm just trying to catch my breath," she said softly, her voice kind but firm. Despite her outward calm, Helen's thoughts churned beneath the surface. Her mind wandered back to the accident that had changed everything. A rainy night, the sound of screeching tires, and the blinding pain that followed. The loss of her leg had not only altered her physical reality, but thrust her into a world where she was constantly judged, pitied, or underestimated. Even her accomplishments as a Paralympian hadn't erased the sting of those early days, when people whispered behind her back or avoided her altogether. She rubbed her temples lightly, willing herself to focus on the present. "Not now," she thought. "Don't let it drag you down now." Nearby, Brad Mitchell stood with his arms crossed, his irritation evident in every sharp movement. He glanced at his watch, muttering under his breath. "This is ridiculous," he grumbled to no one in particular. "I'm being treated like a criminal over a simple misunderstanding." Charlie, standing a few feet away, kept his expression neutral as he observed the escalating tension. After exchanging a quiet word with another officer, he walked over to Helen. His voice was gentle as he crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "Ma'am, I hope you're doing okay. Is there anything else you need right now?" Helen shook her head. "I'll be fine, thank you. Just tired." She hesitated before adding, "Thank you for stepping in earlier. It means a lot." Charlie smiled faintly, the kind that carried a sincerity Helen hadn't expected. "It's the least I could do," he said. "You know, my mom used to talk about you all the time when I was a kid. She showed me videos of your races, said you were proof that nothing could hold someone back if they were determined enough." Helen tilted her head slightly. Her curiosity piqued. "Your mom sounds like a remarkable woman." "She is," Charlie replied, his smile growing. "She always said people like you don't just inspire individuals. You remind entire communities what's possible. She's going to flip when I tell her I met you." For the first time since the incident, Helen felt a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't just the compliment, it was the way Charlie spoke, as if she were more than just a name or a face on a screen. For a fleeting moment, she didn't feel like a symbol, but a person, seen and valued. Meanwhile, Brad's voice cut through the relative calm. "Are we done here yet?" he snapped. "I've got a job to get to, and this is a waste of everyone's time." Charlie straightened, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Sir, I've already asked you to remain patient while we handle this situation. The more cooperative you are, the quicker we can resolve this." Brad threw up his hands in exasperation. "This is absurd. I didn't do anything wrong. She tripped. End of story." The murmurs of nearby onlookers grew louder, their disapproval evident. Helen could feel the energy in the air shifting as more people rallied behind her. A young woman spoke up, her voice steady and clear. "You didn't even apologize. How is that okay?" Brad opened his mouth to retort but stopped short, clearly realizing he was losing the crowd. His jaw tightened as he looked away, muttering something under his breath that Helen couldn't quite catch. Charlie returned his attention to Helen, his tone softening once again. "I know this can't have been easy for you," he said, "but I want you to know there are a lot of people who look up to you, myself included. Whatever happens here, you've already made an impact." Helen met his gaze, her lips curving into a faint but genuine smile. "Thank you, Charlie. That means more than you know." As the commotion began to settle, Helen allowed herself a moment to absorb the unexpected kindness she had encountered amid the chaos. Her knee still throbbed, and the weight of her past lingered. But for the first time in what felt like hours, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the change she might inspire. Helen sat quietly near the terminal window, watching the planes taxi across the tarmac. Her thoughts were a jumble, fragmented by the earlier confrontation. She hadn't realized how tense her shoulders were until she let out a long, shaky breath. The commotion had settled for now, but something in the air felt different, charged, as if the moment hadn't truly passed. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. At first, she ignored it, but the persistent vibration drew her attention. She picked it up and saw multiple notifications flashing across the screen. Messages from unknown numbers, social media tags, and news alerts crowded her inbox. She frowned, unlocking the device to read the first message. "Have you seen this?" Read the text, followed by a link. Curious but cautious, Helen tapped the link. A video began to play, a shaky recording of her earlier encounter with Brad. The clip captured everything: the shove, Brad's dismissive tone, and Helen struggling to regain her balance. It ended with the crowd murmuring angrily, someone off camera exclaiming, "That's Helen Carter!" Her stomach sank. The video had already been shared thousands of times, and the view count was climbing by the second. Comments flooded the post, a mix of outrage and support. Some praised Helen for her composure, while others lambasted Brad for his behavior. But there were also comments that stung, ones questioning why she hadn't stood up for herself more forcefully, or accusing her of exaggerating the situation for attention. Before Helen could process it all, a woman in a tailored blazer approached, carrying a clipboard and wearing a strained smile. "Ms. Carter?" she asked softly. Helen nodded, her voice measured. "Yes?" The woman introduced herself as a member of the airport's public relations team. "I'm here to help resolve this matter," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "We understand that this incident has drawn quite a bit of attention online, and we'd like to contain the situation before it escalates further." Helen tilted her head slightly. "Contain the situation?" she echoed, her words deliberate. The woman cleared her throat, shifting her weight uncomfortably. "What I mean is, we'd prefer to handle this internally to avoid any negative press for the airport. If you're willing, we can draft a non-disclosure agreement, ensuring this doesn't go any further. In return, we're happy to offer compensation for the inconvenience." Helen stared at her, the words sinking in like stones. It wasn't the first time she'd been asked to stay silent for the sake of someone else's reputation. Her mind flickered to the past, moments when she had bitten her tongue, swallowed her pride, and moved on, all to avoid being labeled difficult or angry. Each of those moments had chipped away at her sense of self, leaving scars that weren't visible, but cut just as deep. "No," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. The woman blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry." "I said no. I'm not signing anything," Helen repeated. "This isn't just about me. What happened back there? It's about respect. It's about how people like me, people with disabilities, people who are different, are treated every day. I can't stay silent about that." The woman's polite mask faltered, but she recovered quickly. "I understand your perspective, Ms. Carter, but please consider—" "I've considered it," Helen interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And my answer is still no." The woman nodded stiffly, retreating with a murmured, "If you change your mind, let us know." As Helen watched her walk away, a wave of emotions crashed over her. Anger, frustration, and a flicker of pride all jostled for dominance. She closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to stay grounded. The murmurs around her grew louder, pulling her back to the present. Passengers nearby were glued to their phones, many of them watching the very video Helen had just seen. Some pointed in her direction, whispering in tones too low for her to make out. A few looked sympathetic while others appeared uncomfortable, as if unsure how to react. "I can't believe he's a pilot," a man muttered to his companion. "You'd think someone in his position would know better." "Yeah," the other replied, shaking her head. "But it's not surprising, is it? People like him always think they're above accountability." Helen's chest tightened. It was strange being the focal point of a conversation she couldn't control. The words weren't directed at her, but they pressed down on her all the same. She felt both seen and scrutinized, caught in a spotlight she hadn't asked for. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a young woman hesitating near her seat. The woman's expression was a mix of admiration and uncertainty, as if she wanted to say something, but wasn't sure how to begin. Finally, she took a step closer. "Ms. Carter?" she said tentatively. Helen turned to her, offering a small, polite smile. "Yes? I just wanted to say thank you for standing your ground. My mom uses a wheelchair, and she's dealt with so much of this kind of thing. Seeing you speak up, it means a lot." The sincerity in her voice caught Helen off guard. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Finally, she said, "Thank you for telling me that. It means more than you know." The woman nodded, her own smile shy but warm. As she walked away, Helen felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this moment could be the start of something bigger. The tension in the terminal thickened as two uniformed airport police officers arrived, their presence commanding immediate attention. Brad Mitchell, standing rigid with his arms crossed, met them with a glare that conveyed more annoyance than concern. Helen Carter remained seated nearby, her cane resting against her leg, her expression a blend of quiet determination and exhaustion. One of the officers, a woman with sharp features and a calm demeanor, approached Brad first. "Sir, we've been called to address an incident involving you and this passenger. Can you explain what happened?" Brad gestured dismissively toward Helen. "This is ridiculous. She was in the middle of the walkway, moving so slowly that it was impossible to get around her. I accidentally bumped her. That's it." The officer's gaze didn't waver. "And you didn't think to offer an apology or check if she was hurt?" Brad scoffed. "Apology? For what? I didn't do anything wrong. If anything, she needs to take responsibility for creating a bottleneck." The officer frowned but said nothing, jotting notes on a small pad. She then turned to Helen. "Ma'am, are you okay? Would you like medical assistance?" "I'm fine," Helen replied, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her chest. "But this wasn't just a bump. He pushed me out of frustration, and then he acted as though I was the problem. It wasn't an accident." Brad let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, come on. Now you're accusing me of what? Assault? Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." Helen's eyes locked on his. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of her resolve. "I may have been moving slowly, but I wasn't the one slowing down basic decency." The words hung in the air, cutting through the low murmurs of the surrounding crowd. Brad's smirk faltered as the gathered bystanders murmured in agreement. The officer cleared her throat, glancing between the two. "All right, we'll need to resolve this away from the public area. Both of you, please come with us to a private room." Helen stood, leaning on her cane for support, while Brad muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." The officers led them through a corridor to a small, sterile room tucked behind the bustling terminal. The space was bare, save for a table and a few chairs. Helen sat down carefully, her leg aching more than she wanted to admit. Brad slouched into a chair across from her, his irritation palpable. One of the officers spoke. "Before we proceed, I need to inform you both that this conversation is being recorded. Ma'am, do you wish to press charges at this time?" Helen hesitated. The question wasn't unexpected, but it carried a weight that made her pause. She glanced at Brad, whose expression had shifted from smug to wary. "No," she said finally, "I don't want to press charges. I just want him to understand what he did and take responsibility for it." Brad's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his tone remained defensive. "Look, I already told you, it wasn't intentional. This whole thing is being blown out of proportion." Helen straightened, meeting his gaze head-on. "It's not about intention. It's about respect. You pushed me aside because you thought your time was more valuable than my dignity. And now you're acting like none of it matters because I'm not pressing charges." Brad opened his mouth to respond, but the officer raised a hand. "Sir, I'd recommend taking a moment before saying anything further." Helen exhaled slowly, the room's silence pressing against her. For years, she had carried the weight of moments like these, Moments where she was made to feel less than, not because of her abilities, but because of other people's assumptions. It didn't matter how many medals she'd won or how many barriers she'd broken. To some, she would always be defined by what she lacked. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look," he said, his voice quieter now. "If this gets out, it could ruin my career. I've got a family to support, bills to pay. Can we just agree this was a misunderstanding and move on?" Helen studied him, searching for a trace of genuine remorse. What she saw was desperation, not for forgiveness, but for self-preservation. The realization stung. "This isn't about ruining your career," she said softly. "It's about acknowledging that your actions have consequences." The officer cleared her throat. "Mr. Mitchell, regardless of the outcome here, we recommend you consider offering a formal apology. It might not change the situation entirely, but it would demonstrate accountability." Brad's jaw tightened, but he nodded begrudgingly. "Fine," he muttered. "I'm sorry for pushing you." Helen nodded, though the apology rang hollow. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing it was the best she would get. As the officers concluded their report and the tension in the room eased slightly, Helen felt an unexpected wave of loneliness wash over her. The fight for dignity, for fairness, was one she had taken on willingly, but moments like these reminded her how isolating that fight could be. Even with the support of strangers and allies, the burden of being a symbol weighed heavily. When she stepped out of the room and back into the terminal, the buzz of the airport seemed louder than before. The crowd had thinned, but a few lingering passengers watched her, their expressions unreadable. Helen tightened her grip on her cane and straightened her back, determined to walk forward without hesitation. The terminal buzzed with a low hum of conversations, announcements, and the shuffle of hurried feet. Helen Carter sat near gate B24, her thoughts a storm of doubt and frustration. She gripped her cane tightly, her gaze fixed on the floor as she replayed the events of the past hour. No matter how composed she appeared on the outside, the weight of everything, Brad's arrogance, the crowd's scrutiny, and the hollow apology, pressed heavily on her chest. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Helen looked up to see a man in his mid-40s standing before her. He had an air of calm confidence, his dark suit slightly wrinkled, and his hair peppered with streaks of gray. He held a phone in his hand, his screen lit up. The man glanced around, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I think you might want to see this." She frowned, curiosity and caution mingling in her mind. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone steady but guarded. "My name's Thomas," he replied, offering a faint, reassuring smile. "I used to work in the airline industry. I saw what happened earlier, and I couldn't just walk away. This video," he gestured to the phone, "is clear proof of what he did to you." Helen hesitated before taking the phone. The video was different from the ones already circulating online. It captured the incident from a different angle, showing Brad's shove in undeniable clarity. His expression, the irritation etched into his face, left no room for misinterpretation. The murmurs of disapproval from the crowd in the background only amplified the scene. She exhaled slowly, handing the phone back to Thomas. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Because I've seen too many people like him get away with it," Thomas said, his tone laced with quiet frustration. "When I worked for an airline, I saw pilots and other staff treat passengers, especially those who were older or had disabilities, like inconveniences. No accountability, no consequences. Someone needs to stand up to them." Helen studied him carefully, searching for any sign of ulterior motives, but all she saw was sincerity. "And you think I'm the person to do that?" she said, more a statement than a question. "I think you already are," Thomas replied. "But I also know how much pressure comes with that. Whatever you decide, I just want you to know you have my support." He slipped a business card into her hand before stepping back. "If you need anything, feel free to reach out. And if you want me to testify about what I've seen in the industry, I'll do it." Before Helen could respond, Thomas disappeared into the crowd, leaving her alone with her thoughts once more. She stared at the card in her hand, the weight of his words settling heavily on her. The video was damning evidence, but using it would thrust her even further into the public eye, a place she wasn't sure she wanted to be. Moments later, her phone buzzed with another notification. This time, it was a message from a reporter requesting an interview about the incident. Helen stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She knew that speaking out would mean exposing herself to more scrutiny, more questions about her past, her career, and her personal life. The narrative could easily shift from the issue at hand to dissecting her as an individual. A memory surfaced, unbidden. She was back at the starting line of the Paralympic Games, the crowd roaring in anticipation. She had felt the same mixture of fear and determination then, knowing that the race wasn't just about her. It was about representing a community that had been overlooked and underestimated for far too long. But this wasn't a race. This was her life, her reputation, and her values on the line. Helen pressed her phone to her chest, closing her eyes. She had spent years advocating for equality and respect, and she knew that silence now would feel like a betrayal, not just to herself, but to everyone who had ever looked up to her. Her thoughts were interrupted as a family passed by, their young daughter pointing excitedly at a large digital screen nearby. Helen followed the child's gaze to see a banner that read, "Paralympic Beyond Limits." The words were bold and bright, accompanied by images of athletes defying expectations and pushing boundaries. Helen's breath caught in her throat. The message was clear, a reminder of what she had fought for and what still needed to be done. The weight in her chest lifted slightly, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. She straightened her posture, her grip on the cane firm but steady. The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. Helen sat in a quiet corner of the terminal, her mind racing despite the stillness of her surroundings. The events of the past few hours felt surreal, and the weight of each decision pressed heavily on her. She was no stranger to public scrutiny, but this felt different, raw, immediate, and entirely unexpected. A young woman with a camera slung over her shoulder approached hesitantly. "Ms. Carter?" she asked, her voice tinged with both nervousness and excitement. Helen glanced up, offering a polite smile. "Yes. I'm Jessica with the local news," the woman said quickly. "I've been covering the Paralympic Games and, well, I happened to be here when everything went down. Would you mind giving a quick interview? Just a few questions about what happened?" Helen hesitated, the weight of the request settling over her. She had spent years advocating for dignity and equality, but stepping into the spotlight now could have far-reaching consequences. Yet as she glanced around at the curious faces still watching her from afar, she realized this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or treated as an inconvenience. "All right," Helen said, her tone steady. "Let's do it." Jessica quickly set up her camera, adjusting the microphone as Helen smoothed her blouse and sat up straighter. "Thank you so much for agreeing to this," Jessica said earnestly. "I think your story could really make an impact." As the camera began rolling, Jessica asked, "Ms. Carter, can you share your thoughts on what happened earlier today?" Helen's voice was calm but resolute. What happened today wasn't just about one person shoving another. It was about a mindset, one that sees certain people as less deserving of respect simply because they move differently, look different, or need a little more time. That's the real issue here. Jessica nodded, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad. "Do you feel this reflects a larger problem in society?" "I do," Helen replied. "We live in a world that often values speed and convenience over compassion and understanding. But people shouldn't have to prove their worth to be treated with basic decency. This isn't just my story. It's the story of anyone who's ever been dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's expectations." The interview lasted only a few minutes, but every word felt heavy with significance. When it ended, Jessica thanked Helen profusely and promised to share the story responsibly. As the young reporter packed up her equipment, Helen leaned back in her chair, feeling both drained and oddly invigorated. Within an hour, clips from the interview began circulating online. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Support poured in from advocacy groups, athletes, and everyday people who resonated with Helen's message. But alongside the praise came criticism. Some accused her of blowing the situation out of proportion, suggesting she was using her Paralympic fame to draw attention to herself. Meanwhile, in another part of the airport, Brad Mitchell sat in a staff lounge, scrolling through his phone with growing unease. His name was everywhere, attached to headlines that cast him in an unflattering light. The more he read, the more his frustration boiled over. His phone buzzed, and the caller ID displayed the name of his supervisor. Reluctantly, he answered. "Brad," the voice on the other end began, "we've received several complaints about your behavior today. This situation is escalating quickly, and it's not looking good for the airline." Brad gritted his teeth. "It's being blown out of proportion," he said defensively. "I didn't do anything wrong. She's the one turning this into a media circus." "Regardless," the supervisor replied sharply, "your actions reflect on us. I suggest you find a way to de-escalate this before it does any more damage." The call ended abruptly, leaving Brad seething. Instead of taking responsibility, he doubled down, venting to a colleague nearby. "She's milking this for all it's worth," he muttered, "using her status to make me look like the bad guy." Back in the terminal, Helen was joined by Charlie, who had just finished speaking with airport security. He sat down beside her, his expression a mix of concern and admiration. "You handled that interview well," he said. "Thank you," Helen replied, "but I'm starting to wonder if I made the right choice. What if this just creates more division?" Charlie shook his head. "Division only happens when people refuse to listen. You're giving people something to think about, something they can't ignore. That's not a bad thing." He hesitated before continuing. "You know, my family faced a lot of discrimination when we first came to this country. My parents worked harder than anyone I've ever known, but they were always treated like they didn't belong. Seeing someone like you stand up for what's right, it gives me hope." Helen felt a lump rise in her throat. She placed a hand on Charlie's shoulder, grateful for his honesty. "Thank you, Charlie," she said softly. "That means more than you know." As the day wore on, the incident continued to gain traction. Advocacy organizations began issuing statements in support of Helen, calling for systemic changes in how public spaces accommodated and respected individuals with disabilities. Major news outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach and sparking widespread debate. Helen couldn't ignore the growing pressure. The path she had chosen felt increasingly uncertain, but as she looked around at the faces of strangers who now seemed to carry an unspoken solidarity, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about her anymore. The airport terminal was quieter now, but Helen Carter could still feel the storm brewing beyond its walls. Notifications on her phone lit up like a firestorm, each ping a reminder of how quickly the incident had spiraled. She skimmed through her messages cautiously, her heart sinking as she saw a headline from a prominent news outlet. "Pilot claims Paralympian exaggerates incident for publicity." The article quoted Brad Mitchell extensively, painting him as a misunderstood professional, unfairly targeted by a media frenzy. "She turned a simple misunderstanding into a spectacle," Brad was quoted as saying. "It's unfortunate that someone with her platform is using it to stir unnecessary controversy." Helen closed her eyes and exhaled sharply. The words stung more than she expected. The accusations weren't new, but coming from someone who had been in the wrong made it all the more infuriating. Public opinion was divided, with some commenters supporting Brad's narrative while others rushed to Helen's defense. The polarization was palpable, and it made Helen question whether she had made the right choice in speaking out. A call came through, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID displayed a familiar name, Sarah, one of the organizers of the Paralympic Conference. Helen answered hesitantly. "Hi, Sarah," she said, her voice tinged with weariness. "Helen, I just wanted to check in," Sarah began, her tone careful. "We've seen what's been happening, and we're all behind you. But some of the board members are concerned. They think it might be best for you to step back from the spotlight for a bit, just until things calm down." Helen stiffened. "Step back," she echoed. "You're asking me to stay quiet?" No, Sarah assured her quickly. "That's not what I mean. We just don't want this situation to overshadow the message you're trying to share at the conference. People might lose sight of what really matters." Helen felt a pang of disappointment. "I understand," she said, though the words tasted bitter. "Thanks for letting me know." After ending the call, Helen sat in silence, the phone still in her hand. The idea of retreating, of letting the noise fade, was tempting. It would be easier, safer, but it would also mean abandoning the principles she had spent her life fighting for. The thought weighed heavily on her. pulling her back to a memory she hadn't revisited in years. She was 24, lying in a hospital bed with bandages covering what remained of her right leg. The world outside felt distant and unreachable. A nurse had entered, her face kind but unreadable, and placed a mirror in Helen's hand. "Take your time," the nurse had said softly. "But when you're ready, look." Helen had stared at the mirror for what felt like an eternity before finally raising it to see her reflection. The woman staring back was a stranger, her body irrevocably changed, her spirit fractured. In that moment, she had made herself a promise. She would rebuild, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever felt broken or unseen. That promise now echoed in her mind, reminding her why she had taken those first tentative steps toward a new life, why she had trained relentlessly, and why she had crossed the finish line at the Paralympics with tears streaming down her face. It was never just about the medals. It was about proving that resilience wasn't just a word. It was a choice. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her back to the present. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. The text was simple. "Check your email. I think this might help." Curiosity piqued, Helen opened her email and found a message with an attached video. It was from the same man who had approached her earlier, Thomas. The subject line read, "For the truth." Helen opened them a video, her pulse quickening as the footage played. The angle was different, but the scene was unmistakable. Brad Mitchell's face was clearly visible, his frustration evident as he shoved past her. His words, captured in damning clarity, were impossible to misinterpret. "Get out of the way! You're holding everyone up!" Helen paused the video, her hand trembling slightly. This was it, the proof she needed. But as she stared at the frozen frame of Brad's face, another thought crept in. If she released the video, the focus could shift entirely to him, reducing a broader conversation about respect and equality to a personal attack. Did she want that? Did she want to be the face of his downfall? Or did she want to use this moment to build something larger? The weight of the decision settled over her like a heavy cloak. She took a deep breath, the words of her younger self surfacing once more. "You're stronger than this. Remember why you started." Helen knew she couldn't do this alone. She composed an email to the Paralympic organizers, attaching the video and explaining her plan. The message was clear. She needed their support to ensure the story was told in a way that emphasized change, not vengeance. As she hit send, a sense of calm washed over her. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one she had chosen with conviction. Helen rose from her seat, her cane tapping against the floor with each deliberate step. She wasn't just walking forward, she was stepping into a purpose far greater than herself. The conference room was abuzz with quiet conversations and the soft clicks of cameras being adjusted. Reporters filled every available seat, their notepads and recording devices ready to capture the story of the day. At the front of the room, a podium stood under a spotlight, flanked by two large screens displaying the Paralympic logo. Helen Carter sat to the side, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but focused. The past 48 hours had been a whirlwind of preparation. With the support of the Paralympic organization and her legal team, Helen had decided to take the narrative into her own hands. She knew this wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about addressing a deeper issue that extended far beyond her personal experience. A man in a crisp suit approached the podium, tapping the microphone to test the sound. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice steady. "Thank you for being here today. We will begin shortly, but I'd like to remind everyone to remain respectful during this event. Ms. Helen Carter will be addressing the recent incident at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport and the broader implications it holds." Helen rose slowly, her cane in hand, and made her way to the podium. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her as she adjusted the microphone. She glanced at her notes briefly before looking up, meeting the gaze of the crowd with quiet determination. "Thank you for coming," she began. "What happened to me at the airport was not an isolated event. It was a moment that reflects a much larger problem, a problem rooted in how we treat those who don't fit into society's narrow definition of normal." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "For years, I've faced challenges because of my disability. I lost my leg in an accident that could have ended my life. But I survived and I rebuilt. I became a Paralympian not to prove anything to others, but to prove to myself that I was still whole. Yet despite my achievements, there are still moments, like what happened at the airport, where I am reminded that to some, I will always be seen as less. Helen paused, letting her words settle in the air. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been dismissed, overlooked, or treated as an inconvenience. It's about changing the way we think and act, so that respect is not something earned, but something given freely, as it should be. She gestured to one of the screens behind her. This video may have started a conversation, but it's not the whole story. The real story is the countless moments that go unseen, the everyday acts of dismissal and disrespect that people with disabilities endure. That's what needs to change. As the video of Brad's actions played silently on the screen, the audience watched intently. The clarity of the footage left no room for doubt. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, their reactions ranging from shock to indignation. When the video ended, Helen stepped back to the microphone. I am not here to vilify anyone, she said firmly, but accountability is necessary if we are to move forward. I hope this moment sparks not just outrage, but action. In the hours that followed, Helen's words spread rapidly, amplified by social media and news outlets. The video became a rallying point for advocacy groups and individuals who had long fought for greater inclusion and respect. But not everyone was on Helen's side. Brad Mitchell, now feeling the pressure mounting against him, responded publicly. In a televised interview, he claimed, "That video doesn't tell the whole story. It's been edited to make me look bad. This is nothing more than a coordinated attack on my character." Brad's denial only fueled the fire. His attempts to rally support from colleagues in the airline industry were met with mixed responses. Some defended him, citing his years of experience, while others distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their reputations. The situation took a dramatic turn when a whistleblower within Brad's airline leaked internal documents to the press. The documents revealed a troubling pattern of complaints against Brad, ranging from rude behavior toward passengers to outright discriminatory remarks. Each incident had been quietly resolved to avoid public scrutiny. The revelations sent shockwaves through the industry, and the public's perception of Brad shifted sharply. His denials rang hollow in the face of mounting evidence. But the final blow came from an unexpected source, his ex-wife. In an interview that aired nationwide, she spoke candidly about her experiences with Brad. "He's always had a way of deflecting blame," she said. "Whenever something went wrong, it was never his fault. He has a habit of looking down on others, of treating people as if they're beneath him. It's a pattern, and it's been there for as long as I've known him." Her words resonated deeply, casting Brad in an even harsher light. As public opinion turned decisively against him, Helen found herself at the center of a broader movement. But while the support was overwhelming, she knew it wasn't enough. In a quiet moment of reflection, Helen thought back to her speech. The applause and praise had been validating, but they weren't the goal. Real change required more than words. It required action, policy, and a cultural shift. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The brightly lit studio buzzed with anticipation. Rows of audience members filled the space, their faces a mixture of curiosity and tension. The stage was modest, set with 2 chairs and a small coffee table, flanked by towering screens showing live feeds of the event. At the center of it all, Helen Carter sat poised, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Across from her, Brad Mitchell adjusted his tie, his face carefully neutral but his jaw tight. The moderator, a seasoned journalist with a calm demeanor, introduced the session. "Welcome, everyone. Today we delve into a story that has sparked national debate about respect, equality, and the treatment of individuals with disabilities. Joining us are 2 key figures at the heart of this discussion: Helen Carter, Paralympic gold medalist and advocate, and Brad Mitchell, the airline pilot involved in the recent incident at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Thank you both for being here." Helen nodded politely, while Brad offered a tight-lipped smile. The first few questions were directed at Helen, allowing her to recount the events at the airport. She spoke plainly, her tone steady but firm. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she emphasized. "It's about how we, as a society, treat people who don't fit into the mold of what's considered normal." It's about respect, not as something you earn, but as something everyone deserves. When the moderator turned to Brad, his tone shifted to defense. Look, Brad began, leaning forward slightly. I regret that the situation escalated the way it did. But let's be honest here. This was blown out of proportion. I didn't even realize who Miss Carter was at the time. It wasn't personal. The moderator pressed him. Some have argued that your reaction reflects a deeper issue, how people with disabilities are often dismissed or disrespected. What do you say to that? Brad's expression hardened. I think it's unfair to generalize my actions like that. I've spent my career working under pressure, making critical decisions. I didn't dismiss her. I was simply focused on my responsibilities. Helen leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but piercing. Your responsibilities don't excuse a lack of basic decency. This isn't about whether you recognize me or not. It's about how you saw me, as an inconvenience, not a person. The tension between them was palpable. Brad's next words were sharper. With all due respect, Ms. Carter, I think you're leveraging your status to manipulate public perception. It's easy to play the victim when you've got an entire community behind you. Helen didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze with unwavering resolve. I don't need pity or victimhood, Mr. Mitchell. What I need, and what everyone deserves, is respect. Not because of what I've achieved, but because I'm a human being. The audience erupted into applause, their support for Helen clear. Brad's lips pressed into a thin line as he sat back, his defenses faltering. As the discussion continued, a moment shifted the room. A woman in the audience, her hair streaked with gray, raised her hand. The moderator acknowledged her, and a microphone was passed down. My name is Diane, she began, her voice steady but emotional. I was a flight attendant for 25 years, and I recognize Mr. Mitchell. I worked with him on several flights, and I have to say, his behavior toward passengers and staff was often condescending. I experienced it firsthand. A hush fell over the room as Diane continued. I once saw him berate a passenger with a disability because they needed extra time to board. He said it was slowing everyone down. I wanted to speak up, but I was afraid of losing my job. Hearing this story, it brought all of that back. The revelation sent shockwaves through the audience. Brad's face reddened, and he looked down, avoiding eye contact. The moderator turned to him. Mr. Mitchell, would you like to respond? Brad hesitated before stammering. I don't recall that incident. Helen seized the moment. This isn't about pointing fingers or ruining careers. It's about acknowledging the systemic issues that allow this kind of behavior to persist. If we don't confront these patterns, they'll continue to harm people, passengers, employees, entire communities. Her words resonated deeply, and the applause that followed was thunderous. As the session wrapped up, the moderator asked Helen about her next steps. She responded with clarity and purpose. This isn't the end of the conversation. It's just the beginning. I'm calling on organizations, companies, and individuals to take a hard look at their practices and their attitudes. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with accountability and a willingness to do better. The broadcast ended, but the impact was immediate. Social media exploded with discussions about the interview, with hashtags like #RespectForAll and #StandWithHelen trending nationwide. Advocacy groups praised Helen's composure and conviction, while others called for broader industry reforms to address discrimination. Later that evening, Helen received a call from a prominent nonprofit organization. Ms. Carter, the voice on the other end said warmly, we would be honored if you would serve as the spokesperson for our new campaign on equality and inclusion. Helen smiled, the weight of the day momentarily lifting. I'd be happy to, she replied. Let's get to work. Helen sat at her kitchen table, the faint hum of the television in the background. Her laptop screen glowed with an email she had opened moments ago, its words still sinking in. The message was from a prominent human rights organization, inviting her to lead a campaign advocating for equality and inclusion in public spaces. The opportunity was monumental, but it carried with it a weight that made her hesitate. The sound of her phone vibrating on the table pulled her attention away. It was Charlie. She answered, grateful for the familiar voice. Hey, Helen, he said warmly. I saw the news. You're making waves. Helen smiled faintly. Waves or ripples? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Don't downplay it, Charlie replied. You're doing something big here. But I'm guessing that email from the rights organization has you tied up in knots? How'd you know? She asked, surprised. I've seen that look before, he said, his tone light but understanding. You're worried about whether you can handle it, right? Helen exhaled deeply. It's not just that. If I take this on, it's not just my voice anymore. It's the voices of everyone who's been affected by these issues. That's a lot of responsibility. And that's exactly why they chose you, Charlie said firmly, because they know you'll treat it with the seriousness it deserves. But Helen, you've already proven you're not afraid to fight for what's right. This is just the next step. His words resonated, cutting through the doubt clouding her mind. After a long pause, she said, You always know what to say, don't you? It's a gift, he joked. But seriously, Helen, you've got this. Later that evening, she sent her reply, accepting the invitation. The weight of the decision lifted slightly, replaced by a quiet resolve. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but the chance to create real change was worth every challenge. The following week, Helen's world was upended once more when she received a legal notice from Brad Mitchell. He was suing her for defamation, claiming that her public statements had damaged his reputation and career. The lawsuit demanded a public apology and a substantial financial settlement. The notice arrived with a thud on her doorstep, its contents making her stomach churn. Her lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Clara, sat across from her in Helen's living room, reviewing the document. Brad's trying to flip the narrative, Clara said, her tone clipped. He wants to make this about his reputation instead of the systemic issues you've been highlighting. And he's hoping I'll back down, Helen added, her voice firm despite the unease creeping into her chest. Clara nodded. Exactly. But we're not going to let that happen. The courtroom was cold and sterile, its air thick with tension. Helen sat beside Clara at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across the room, Brad sat with his legal team, his expression a mixture of frustration and confidence. The judge entered and the room quieted as the proceedings began. Brad's lawyer wasted no time painting Helen as an opportunist. This case is about a woman who has chosen to capitalize on a minor misunderstanding to further her own agenda, he declared. My client has dedicated years to his profession, and his character is now under attack because of exaggerated claims. Clara responded with equal determination. This case isn't about a single person's career. It's about holding individuals accountable for their actions and addressing the broader issue of discrimination. My client has spoken out not to harm Mr. Mitchell, but to advocate for change. The back and forth was intense, each side presenting their arguments with precision. At one point, Brad's lawyer introduced emails and statements from his colleagues defending his professionalism. But the atmosphere shifted dramatically when Clara called a surprise witness, a former co-worker of Brad's. The man, a retired flight attendant named Greg, stepped up to the stand. I worked with Brad for over a decade, he began, his voice steady. And while he's a skilled pilot, his attitude toward passengers and crew has always been an issue. I've seen him dismiss complaints from disabled passengers, claiming they were just looking for special treatment. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Greg's testimony settling over everyone present. Brad's lawyer tried to discredit him, but Greg remained composed, his statements unwavering. Outside the courtroom, public opinion grew increasingly divided. Social media was flooded with arguments on both sides. Some accused Helen of ruining Brad's life, while others hailed her as a hero for standing up against ingrained biases. Helen tried to ignore the noise, but it was impossible to escape entirely. Each headline and comment added to the pressure, reminding her of the stakes. Yet amidst the chaos, messages of support continued to trickle in, from athletes, activists, and strangers who saw their own struggles reflected in her fight. As the session ended for the day, the judge announced that additional evidence would need to be reviewed before a final decision could be made. The trial was postponed, leaving both sides in limbo. Helen walked out of the courthouse with Clara by her side, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. The fight was far from over, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about Brad or even about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unworthy. As she stood on the courthouse steps, a journalist called out, "Ms. Carter, do you have any comment?" Helen paused, her cane steady in her hand. "This isn't just about one incident," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "It's about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. And that's a fight worth having." Helen Carter sat in her living room, her phone vibrating incessantly on the coffee table. The curtains were drawn, shutting out the world, but the tension inside was palpable. A fresh wave of online threats had surfaced, each one more vicious than the last. Words like troublemaker and liar peppered the messages, along with accusations that she was on a personal crusade to destroy Brad Mitchell's life. Her sister June sat across from her, scrolling through the comments with a grim expression. "Helen, this is getting out of hand," June said, her voice tight with worry. "Some of these people are unhinged. They're saying they know where you live." Helen leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "I know, June. I've seen the messages." June's eyes filled with frustration and fear. "You need to stop. This fight, it's not worth your safety. It's not worth our family living in fear." The words stung more than Helen wanted to admit. She had always been the strong one, the resilient one, but the weight of her choices was beginning to take its toll. "If I back down now, what does that say to everyone watching? To the people who've supported me?" she asked quietly. "It says you're human," June replied, her voice softening, "and that you know when to protect yourself." Before Helen could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Charlie. She picked up, grateful for the steadying presence of her friend. "Helen, I just got off the phone with a contact at the Human Rights Coalition," Charlie began without preamble. "They've offered to help. Security, legal advice, whatever you need. They're in your corner." Helen exhaled deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you, Charlie. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You don't have to," he replied simply. "We're in this together. And listen, don't let the threats scare you into silence. That's exactly what they want." His words reignited a spark of determination in Helen. "I won't," she said firmly. "This fight is too important." Meanwhile, a breaking news alert flashed across every major network. A prominent investigative journalist had released a detailed report on Brad Mitchell's past. The article outlined a history of complaints filed against him, including a lawsuit from a former coworker alleging discrimination and verbal abuse. The lawsuit, it revealed, had been settled quietly, with the airline paying out a significant sum to avoid public scrutiny. The report was damning, painting a picture of a man whose actions had long gone unchecked. Within hours, the airline released a statement announcing Brad's suspension, pending a thorough investigation. The backlash was swift and overwhelming, with public opinion turning sharply against him. Helen sat at her desk, reading the article in disbelief. The revelations validated everything she had been fighting for, but they also exposed the depth of the systemic issues she was up against. She knew this was bigger than Brad. It was about a culture that had allowed his behavior to persist. That evening, Helen addressed a packed auditorium at a previously scheduled event for the Paralympic organization. The energy in the room was electric, the audience hanging on her every word. "This fight," she began, her voice steady and clear, "is not about me, and it's not about Brad Mitchell. It's about how we, as a society, choose to treat one another. Do we see each other as obstacles, inconveniences, or do we see each other as human beings, deserving of respect and dignity?" The room erupted in applause, but Helen held up a hand, quieting the crowd. "I won't lie to you," she continued. "This has been one of the hardest battles of my life, but I stand here today because I know it's worth it. Not for me, but for the countless people who've been told they're less than, who've been made to feel invisible. That ends here. That ends now." Her words resonated deeply, drawing tears from some and a standing ovation from others. As the applause washed over her, Helen felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't fighting alone. The next day, the airline released a second statement, this time committing to tangible changes. They announced a comprehensive training program for all employees, focusing on inclusivity and respect. Additionally, they pledged to work with Helen and other advocates to improve policies and practices across the industry. Helen read the statement with a mixture of relief and resolve. It was a step in the right direction, but she knew there was still much work to be done. As she sat at her desk, drafting a response, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been grueling, but it had also reaffirmed her belief in the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up for what was right. The courtroom was filled with an air of heavy anticipation. Rows of seats were packed with observers, reporters scribbling notes, supporters of Helen Carter, and curious onlookers. The sound of shuffling papers and quiet whispers reverberated through the room as everyone awaited the day's proceedings. At the front, Helen sat beside her lawyer, Clara, her posture upright and composed, though her hands rested tensely on the table. Across from her, Brad Mitchell adjusted his tie, his expression a careful mask of indifference. His lawyer stood nearby, rifling through a stack of documents, ready to defend him with a vigor that had been on full display throughout the trial. The judge entered and the room fell into silence. "Let's proceed," she said, her voice measured and firm. Brad's lawyer was the first to speak, striding confidently to the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he began, "this case has been blown wildly out of proportion. What we have here is a misunderstanding, a minor incident that has been exaggerated to the point of defamation. My client, a respected airline pilot, is now facing baseless accusations that threaten his career and livelihood." He gestured toward Helen's side of the courtroom. "The plaintiff has turned this into a spectacle, leveraging her fame to create a narrative that paints my client as a villain. But the evidence presented thus far lacks substance. There is no concrete proof of intent, and the allegations of discrimination are purely speculative." Clara stood next, her demeanor calm but commanding. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is not about defamation. It is about accountability. The defendant's actions at the airport were not an isolated incident. Through witness testimony and additional evidence, we will demonstrate that Mr. Mitchell has a history of dismissive and discriminatory behavior, particularly toward individuals with disabilities." The judge nodded for Clara to continue, and she called her first witness, a former flight attendant who had worked under Brad's supervision. The woman in her early 50s took the stand, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I worked with Mr. Mitchell for several years," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "While he's undoubtedly skilled at his job, his attitude toward passengers and staff has always been less than professional. I've witnessed him speak dismissively to passengers with mobility challenges, even rolling his eyes when they needed assistance." The lawyer for Brad objected, but the judge allowed the testimony to proceed. The flight attendant recounted specific incidents, each one chipping away at the image Brad's team had tried to construct. Next, Clara presented an email exchange obtained from a former airline employee, detailing complaints filed against Brad. The documents revealed that multiple grievances had been filed over the years, but each had been quietly resolved with little consequence. The courtroom murmured as Clara read aloud from one of the emails. "Brad Mitchell is a liability. His behavior toward passengers undermines the standards we strive to uphold." Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer leaning in to whisper something in his ear. During a brief recess, Helen sat in the quiet of a side room, her mind swirling. The evidence was strong, but she knew the case was far from over. Clara entered, her expression a mixture of determination and concern. "Brad's team has approached us with a settlement offer," Clara said, handing Helen a piece of paper. "They're willing to issue a formal apology and donate to a disability rights organization in exchange for dropping the case." Helen stared at the document, the weight of the decision pressing on her. "And if I refuse?" Clara's gaze was steady. "We move forward, but it'll be a fight. The media will eat it up, and Brad's team will do everything they can to discredit you. It'll be tough, Helen." Helen leaned back, the memory of her accident flashing in her mind. She could still hear the screech of tires, the shouts of bystanders, and the crushing realization that her life would never be the same. In that hospital bed, she had made a promise to herself. She would never let fear dictate her actions again. "Clara," Helen said, her voice firm, "I'm not backing down. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about every person who's been dismissed or belittled. If I stay silent, what message does that send?" Clara nodded, a small smile forming. I thought you'd say that. As the trial resumed, Clara stood to present a new piece of evidence, a video sent anonymously to Helen's legal team just days earlier. The judge permitted it to be played, and the room grew silent as the footage began. It showed Brad Mitchell in a private conversation, his voice unmistakable. People like her, he said, always make things more complicated. They demand special treatment, and then they play the victim when things don't go their way. The video ended and the room erupted into murmurs. Brad's face turned pale, and his lawyer scrambled to object, claiming the video was taken out of context. The judge silenced the objections with a sharp rap of her gavel. Mr. Mitchell, the judge said, her tone icy. Care to explain this? Brad stammered, struggling to find the words. That was a private conversation. It doesn't mean anything. It means everything, Helen said softly, her voice cutting through the room. It means you've been given the privilege of authority and you've abused it to demean others. The judge nodded, signaling that the day's proceedings were over. Court is adjourned. We will reconvene tomorrow for final statements. As Helen walked out of the courtroom, the tension in her chest eased slightly. She wasn't sure what the verdict would be, but she knew one thing for certain. She had fought with everything she had. The courtroom was silent, save for the occasional rustle of papers and the soft hum of whispers that quickly died down. All eyes were on Helen Carter as she rose from her seat. The judge had given her the opportunity to deliver a closing statement before the verdict, and the weight of the moment was not lost on her. Helen walked slowly to the stand, her cane tapping rhythmically against the polished floor. She paused to steady herself, looking out over the sea of faces, reporters, activists, supporters, and even skeptics. Brad Mitchell sat to her left, his expression unreadable, but his body language stiff, like a man bracing for impact. Helen took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of every battle she had fought. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, today is not just about what happened to me at an airport. It's about something much bigger. It's about the kind of society we want to live in. She let her words sink in before continuing. This is not about one person or one incident. This is about how we treat each other when no one is looking, how we respect the dignity of those who are different from us. Whether that difference is physical, cultural, or circumstantial, it should never determine someone's worth. Helen turned her gaze toward Brad, but her words remained measured and deliberate. I'm not here to vilify anyone. I'm here to hold up a mirror to a culture that has allowed dismissiveness and discrimination to persist for far too long. And if today's decision sparks even the smallest change, then this fight will have been worth it. The room was utterly silent, captivated by her presence. Helen straightened her shoulders, her voice gaining strength. I will continue to fight, not for myself, but for every person who has been told they are less than, who has been overlooked or ignored. Together we can build a society where respect is the rule, not the exception. With that, she stepped back, her gaze unwavering as she returned to her seat. The judge nodded, acknowledging the gravity of her statement, and called for a brief recess before the final verdict. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The judge cleared her throat, her tone even but firm as she delivered the ruling. After careful review of the evidence and testimonies presented, this court finds Mr. Brad Mitchell guilty of discriminatory behavior and verbal misconduct. A collective murmur rippled through the room. The judge continued. Mr. Mitchell is hereby ordered to issue a public apology to Ms. Carter and to pay a monetary settlement as restitution. Furthermore, the court urges the airline to address systemic issues within its organization to prevent incidents like this from occurring in the future. Helen exhaled softly, her grip on her cane relaxing. The words felt like a vindication, not just for her, but for everyone who had been following the case. Outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered, their energy palpable. Helen stepped through the heavy wooden doors into the bright afternoon sun, greeted by a wave of applause and cheers. Signs bearing messages like, "Respect for all," and "Justice for Helen," bobbed in the air, held high by supporters of all ages. At the front of the crowd, a group of children in wheelchairs held a banner that read, "Thank you, Helen." The sight brought a lump to her throat. She paused, letting the moment wash over her. Charlie appeared at her side, his grin wide and his eyes full of admiration. "You did it," he said, pulling her into a warm hug. "You've done something that'll be remembered for generations." Helen smiled, her voice tinged with emotion. "I didn't do it alone." As the crowd surged forward, eager to greet her, Helen caught sight of Brad slipping out a side door, his head down and his pace hurried. A swarm of reporters followed him, their questions relentless. The man who had once carried himself with arrogance now seemed small, defeated. Helen felt no triumph in his downfall, only a quiet hope that this might be the start of a deeper change for him as well. Standing at the top of the courthouse steps, Helen turned back to the crowd. The energy around her was electric, but her focus remained on the children holding the banner. Their smiles were wide, their eyes full of hope. She raised her hand in acknowledgement, and their cheers grew louder. In that moment, Helen felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done, but she knew she wasn't alone in it. The voices of those who stood with her, who believed in her message, were stronger than any doubt or fear. As she descended the steps, the sunlight warming her face, Helen allowed herself a rare smile. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt full of possibility. Helen Carter sat by her living room window, the warm afternoon sun casting a golden glow across the room. The soft hum of the city outside provided a backdrop to her thoughts. Though the courtroom battle was behind her, its echoes lingered, intertwined with the stories of countless others who had endured similar injustices but lacked the platform to speak out. She traced her fingers along the armrest of her chair, her mind drifting back to the faces she had seen at the courthouse. The supporters cheering her on, the children holding banners of encouragement, and even those who had doubted her intentions. Their voices had fueled her resolve, but they also reminded her that the fight was far from over. For every victory like hers, there were countless others still waiting for justice. The familiar chime of an incoming email drew her attention. Helen leaned forward, opening her laptop to see a message from a nonprofit organization she had recently partnered with. They were planning a nationwide campaign to combat discrimination in public spaces and had invited her to lead their next series of workshops. Helen smiled, her heart lifting slightly. The work ahead would be demanding, but it was a purpose she embraced fully. A week later, Helen stood at a podium in a packed conference hall, her cane resting beside her. The room was filled with advocates, educators, and leaders from various organizations, all eager to hear her speak. She adjusted the microphone, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice steady. "I want to share a story that isn't just mine, but one that reflects the resilience of so many. Years ago, after an accident that changed my life forever, I lay in a hospital bed, feeling broken. I didn't just lose a part of my body, I felt like I had lost a part of my identity." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But over time, I realized something important. Resilience isn't just about what you can do on your own. It's about the people who lift you up when you can't stand, the voices that remind you of your worth when you've forgotten it. It's about community." The room was silent, her words resonating deeply. Today, as we work together to create change, I want us to remember that none of us can do this alone. Every step forward is a collective effort, and every victory belongs to all of us. The applause was thunderous, but Helen's focus remained on the message. She knew this was only the beginning of a much larger movement. Meanwhile, in a modest office on the outskirts of the city, Brad Mitchell sat at a desk, surrounded by paperwork. His new job at a small logistics company was far from the prestigious career he once held. But it was a start. The media frenzy had subsided, leaving him to confront the consequences of his actions in relative obscurity. One evening, as he sifted through documents, a newspaper article caught his eye. It was a feature on Helen, highlighting her ongoing advocacy work and the ripple effects of her victory in court. Brad's gaze lingered on her photo, her expression one of quiet determination. A pang of regret washed over him. For weeks he had grappled with his role in the events that had unraveled his life. The anger and defensiveness that once shielded him had given way to reflection and finally clarity. He reached for a piece of paper and began to write. A few days later, Helen opened her mailbox to find a letter addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize. Sitting at her dining table, she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the familiar name at the bottom, Brad Mitchell. The letter was short but heartfelt. Brad admitted to his mistakes, acknowledging the harm his actions and words had caused. He wrote of his ignorance, his arrogance, and his journey toward understanding. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I said and did, the letter read. I know I can't undo the past, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, not for appearances, but because it's the right thing to do. Helen sat in silence for a long moment after finishing the letter. She folded it carefully and placed it in a small wooden box on her shelf, the word peace etched into its lid. Her heart felt lighter, not because she had sought Brad's apology, but because it signaled the possibility of growth and change. The impact of Helen's efforts continued to ripple outward. Major airlines announced new training programs designed to promote inclusivity and respect for all passengers. Public service campaigns featuring Helen's story aired nationwide, inspiring conversations in households, workplaces, and schools. Letters and emails poured in from people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and how Helen's fight had given them hope. Advocacy groups reached out, eager to collaborate with her on future initiatives. Helen became a symbol of resilience and courage, not just for the disabled community, but for anyone who had ever felt overlooked or underestimated. One crisp autumn morning, Helen stood at a park where a new accessibility initiative was being unveiled. Families gathered around, children laughing as they explored the newly installed inclusive playground equipment. A plaque near the entrance read, "In honor of Helen Carter, a champion for dignity and equality." As Helen looked out over the crowd, her heart swelled with gratitude. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the challenges, the victories, and the people who had walked beside her. This moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever fought for a better, fairer world. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her cane steady in her hand, ready to continue the work that still lay ahead. Helen Carter's journey reminds us that true strength isn't just about overcoming personal challenges. It's about using those challenges to inspire change for others. Her story teaches us the power of resilience, the importance of respect, and the impact of standing up against injustice, no matter how daunting the fight may seem. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment where standing up for yourself or someone else felt impossible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of courage, determination, in the relentless pursuit of justice. Your next story awaits.